Okay, so this set of lectures is for Module 3, so post-midterm content. And in particular, we're going to be talking about chapters 9, 10, and 11 that discuss products, product innovation, and services. All right, so we've mentioned this before, but modern marketing has sort of evolved from thinking about it's evolved in a number of ways, but one way in which it's evolved is from, being mostly concerned with commodities. So commodities are sort of unbranded, interchangeable things. Things like raw materials, agricultural products are commodities. Transitioning to goods and then into services, and then people are advocating that we're entering an age where, people care about experiences and authenticity. So this is where we are with products, with this transition from a commodity to an experience. So a commodity or commoditization is something a brand marketer wants to avoid at all costs. So the definition of a commodity means that they're interchangeable. So if I grow soybeans and I take my soybeans to the place where they weigh the soybeans, and I'm like, I see the market for soybeans is $40 a bushel today, but I want to sell mine for $45. They'll be like, no, this is the market price, and this is what people pay. And so you may remember from, Econ 101, the idea there is that we have a completely inelastic demand curve. If I raise my price one bit, no one will buy my stuff. So, as you can imagine, as a marketer who's creating branded products, you want to avoid that at all costs. So, there's been a number of examples where this has happened. So, in the PC industry, for example, once upon a time, PCs were marketed by, you would go online to Dell.com and you would pick out how big your hard drive wanted to be and how much RAM you wanted and what resolution of the screen size and all this stuff. And Dell would put together a custom computer for you and ship it to your house. It was kind of a revolutionary thing at the time. And this created a lot of success for Dell. The problem with that approach, however, is that it positions the product just in terms of the functional benefits. This much hard drive space, this much processing power, this particular graphics card. And then HP and other companies came in and said, well, we have all that same stuff too. So at that point, companies then just start competing on price and how efficiently they can make and distribute products. So in a commodity kind of space, you stop competing on brand and you start competing on efficiencies. So, Yeti has experienced the same issue to a certain extent, right? So when they came on the market, they're like, we're a cooler you can stand on. We're certified bear proof. We keep ice for 5 days, even though you only need it for 5 hours. Like all these very functional benefits that other coolers could come in and say, yeah, we do all that stuff too. So what Yeti has since done is tried to transition away from being just talking about features and benefits all the time to talking about being more of a lifestyle brand. Pepsi-Cola, when it came on the market, the way they tried to take market share from Coca-Cola was essentially like their marketing message was, we're the same thing as Coca-Cola, but at a cheaper price, right? And so when you have these kind of situations, you have marketers starting to compete on price rather than brand image or these other kind of things, right? So think about Apple computers, and they don't talk too much about like what their specs are, right? It's more like, oh, it's the latest cool Apple computer, and they're competing on something other than, these sort of commodities kind of things. This is the classic example here that you often hear trotted out, the Starbucks example, where you have some raw beans, coffee beans out in a field, and then they're worth a few cents per cup, and then you roast them in a particular way, and now all of a sudden they're worth 5 times that, but still measured in cents, and then you take it somewhere and you brew it up, and you serve it to people, and now it's worth maybe $1 a cup or $1.50 a cup. But then you create this Starbucks type experience. It's kind of high end and fancy chairs and cool music and good Wi-Fi and, baristas that say your name and this kind of experience. And now it's worth $5 for a cup. So this idea that this progression is called the progression of value is the way you make big money and have success is not by trading in commodities. That was, for hundreds of years ago, how you were successful. Now, how you're successful is creating customer experiences. So again, we find ourselves sort of evolving to this idea that products should be rooted in experiences. Probably the most extreme viewpoint of this is this idea of service dominant logic. So service dominant logic is sort of an academic perspective. It came out in the Journal of Marketing a number of years ago, and their fundamental premise that there essentially are no products. So a product, a physical good, almost always is just the embodiment of specialized skills and knowledge. In other words, the provision of a service. Right? So we had some engineers that design something and build it, and people that come together and build it, and they put it in this thing, and then they sell it to people, and their service that they provide is embodied in that product, and other people co-produce value with that service by bringing their own expertise and efforts and knowledge and skills to using that product to self-serve, to produce self-service. So, again, so on a more sort of extreme kind of academic view, they might argue there's you shouldn't really be thinking about products, because the idea of products is that there's some inherent value in the product that can be moved around. And ultimately, what is happening is service is being exchanged for service. And that's how marketing happens. So if you're going to be a marketing major, you should just be familiar with this. It's called the service dominant logic perspective. All right. So again, we've seen this before, but a key perspective of this is to stop thinking about products in terms of the actual features of the product, but ultimately, what is the value that consumers are trying to co-create? So we've heard this example. People don't want quarter-inch hole drill bit. They don't want quarter-inch drill bits. They want quarter-inch holes. So this would be the jobs to be done do perspective. So the idea that people don't really care about the attributes of the drill bits. They care about getting a hole in a piece of wood so they can hang up a bookshelf. Now, it's also important to remember that the jobs to be done be perspective, that's popularized by Clayton Christensen, says that all of these products that we buy are ultimately in service of some sort of goal we're trying to achieve, and they further our progress. So an example that they talk about in the Coffee versus Kale book is that if my goal in hanging the shelf is so that I can put books on the shelf, so that I can read them, or so that I can put books on the shelf and ultimately become a well-read person, then an Amazon Kindle might remove my need for the drill bit altogether, because ultimately the goal I'm trying to progress towards is being a well-read person. I don't really care about the drill bit. I don't even care about the shelf. I just need some way to make progress towards that goal. And so the B perspective sort of pushes us to think even further and more abstractly about what the product is, what the service is, with the idea that that's where true innovation happens. Now, the book talks about this idea in terms of the levels of the product, and the core product or the problem that the customer needs solved is what we would call the job to be done perspective. The actual product is then sort of the physical features and benefits related to the product. And then lastly, we have the augmented product. So the augmented product is like sort of a lot of different things that are sort of ancillary and kind of surrounding the features of the product itself. So we talked about one already. Customers themselves are sort of in this space of the augmented product, because ultimately a customer is using the product in order to co-create value, right? So they are, just because you buy the Peloton bike, you also then have to get on it and pedal it a lot before it'll do anything for you. Or, just when you take a class, how hard you study for the class determines how much value you get out of the class itself. So all of these things, part of the augmented product is the customer co-production or co-creation process itself. In service environments, we often have other customers. So we can have, if you're at a club and it has lots of fun, cool people, then you'll have a certain kind of experience versus not if it's empty, right? If you're on an airplane with a screaming baby. Accessibility, so just being able to get the service of the product. We also have, all these kind of things surrounding a product. So you playing fast music in a restaurant, it turns out, will make you eat faster or shop faster or slower. So in grocery stores, they often play kind of slow, calm music because they want you to kind of stroll around the shelves and look around and pick maybe additional items off that you wouldn't have purchased if you would have just been like rushing through the store. So a lot of different things, kind of, there's the Mickey Mouse one in the center with the chocolate chip cookies is a reference to the fact that, under Magic Kingdom, when you come into the gates of Magic Kingdom, they have these nozzles that spray out chocolate chip cookie smell chemicals into the air around this place where they have the bakery, in order to create this kind of warm kind of environment that makes you maybe want to go and buy a cookie. So all these different things are sometimes talked about in terms of the augmented product. Now, another thing that Clayton Christensen, the proponent of the Jobs to be Done B perspective, so a lot of his work is in the area of product innovation. And so in the book, you'll see different, I think they maybe say 50% of consumer products fail. Clayton Christensen says 95% of new products fail. The other textbook I'm referencing here says 80%-ish fail. And remember, we talked about marketers have this need for growth. So the stock market rewards growth. There's lots of incentives in place to grow and sell more and more stuff. And one of the ways you do that is by creating new products. And many times they fail. So some of the more famous ones are pictured here. Probably the most famous is New Coke. So this happened at a time during the Cola Wars, when Coke and Pepsi were sort of fighting it out to who would be have the most market share. And Coke did these extensive taste tests to try to come up with a new flavor of Coke that was seen as in blind taste tests, tasted better than Pepsi and better than Coca-Cola Classic, which was just Coca-Cola at the time. And they made this big splash and did all these advertisements and introduced new Coke, and they were taking old Coke off the shelves or whatever, and people lost their minds, right? So they were just like, how can you steal the Coke that I grew up with? I have all these memories of drinking Coke, and now you're going to take it away and introduce this new Coke. And it was a giant fiasco. Interestingly, they quickly pulled New Coke off the shelf, reintroduced the original recipe and labeled it Coca-Cola Classic with the kind of curly font, and it was that action that actually ultimately propelled them to sort of dominating Pepsi. So, and they claim this in the interview with the CEO that I've seen. He says, like, yeah, turned out to be a really great move. I wish I could say like we did it on purpose. But it's just like an interesting marketing story. Like, you took something away, people realized they really wanted it. They became very animated. They wanted it back. You gave it back to them, and then they sort of made them realize their love for the product. All right, so Crystal Pepsi is another kind of example of something that happened during the Cola Wars. Pepsi, it turns out you can make cola that is clear. They actually reintroduced this a couple years ago, kind of on a limited basis. It's kind of a fun thing, kind of a fun retro thing. But at the time, they thought that it would be a way for Pepsi to get market share, and it just fell flat. People have this idea that clear cola is supposed to taste like lemons and limes or some sort of fruit, and when they drink a clear beverage and it tastes like Coke or Pepsi, it just is weird to them and seems weird and artificial, and they don't like it. So it was a spectacular flop that was in these cola wars. Let's see, Betamax versus VHS. So back when we used to watch, used to have physical things that we would bring to our house in order to watch movies. Betamax was one that was actually superior in technology to VHS, but it ended up, because they, kept the technology proprietary and didn't let people spread it, and didn't, miss the boat on what people were using it for. Like, not always recording home videos, but maybe like watching like really long movies. And it just, even though it was like this, the moral of the story is, even though it was like really much higher quality than VHS, it ended up just losing out. So I remember as a kid, you would go to the video rental store, like a new phenomenon, and you would go there on the weekend and you browse around Blockbuster, pre-Blockbuster. And there would be a section that was Betamax and a section that was VHS. But really, really quickly, that went away, the Betamax. And so it's just seen as one of these sort of, ideas that despite you have the better technology, you made some critical missteps that ended up, you just became irrelevant. Probably the Harley-Davidson perfume there, or cologne, it's not a famous one, but it is sort of indicative of I think it's a good example of when brand extensions go wrong. The Cheetos lip balm as well, right? So companies like Harley and motorcycles and should smell like grease and exhaust and gasoline. Like, why would I want to like create a cologne out of that? Like, it just doesn't seem to make any sense, right? But it's what most new product introductions actually are what are called brand extensions. So where you take an existing brand that has brand equity, we'll talk about it in a second, and put that into a new product category. So you take a Harley-Davidson brand and you put it on some cologne. You think, well, people really love Harley-Davidson motorcycles, so maybe they'll also love Harley-Davidson cologne. All right. And so what tends to happen in these situations is that the core competency, or what people expect from the brand, ends up just not applying to the new product category, and that ends up falling flat. So often brands are pressured for growth. Brand managers are pressured to grow the brand. They introduce brand extensions that try to leverage existing brand equity, but they get away from the core competencies. Yeah. Another set of branding strategies, or kind of is taking a new brand name in an existing category. So Tide, when they introduced Cheer, so Tide, Tide laundry detergent by Procter & Gamble predated Cheer. They wanted to fill up the shelf space and maybe sell at a lower price point, so they invented a new brand in the same category. So they have multiple brands now, so it's a multi-brand. The issue, it's also sometimes referred to as a flanker brand. But the issue here is you could cannibalize your sales. So what you would want in that situation is for all the Tide people to stay producing, buying Tide, but then Cheer to steal market share from a low-cost competitor, right? But the problem is that you might cannibalize sales of Tide. Not as bad as if you said, hey, we have Tide or Tide low cost, because then no one would buy regular Tide detergent. They would all just buy Tide low cost detergent, right? So sometimes in order to sell at a different price point, you have to, sort of hide your product underneath a different brand. And so that can leverage core competencies, but has this cannibalization, concern. So anyway, another classic sort of marketing 2x2, where we have existing product categories and new product categories, and existing brand names and new brand names. So we mentioned the idea of brand equity. So brands have a value to them, a cash value. So on companies' sort of accounting sheets, they will list the value of their brand. So here you just see kind of a couple different estimates. There's a whole literature out there on how to estimate brand value. But as you might imagine, some big ones are like Apple. Facebook's kind of funny, and they don't even have that brand anymore. It's now Meta, so that's an interesting choice. Windows, Amazon, Coca-Cola, Nike, McDonald's, things that you would expect. So the idea is that just attaching this brand name to something makes it more valuable. And so that's kind of how people go about figuring it out. So like, okay, what would this product be as a generic product versus, or an unknown brand versus an Apple product or a Google product, right? So a brand, we use the term brand a lot, so we should probably define it at some point. It is a name, term, sign, or symbol that is intended to identify the goods or products and the sellers. So a brand, historically, you might think of like a cattle brand, was a way of sort of showing that you owned this thing. And marketers started putting their brands on stuff as we sort of switched from commodities to goods. So commodities aren't branded. As you start making goods, you want to say, hey, I made this good. I'm going to put my name on it. And so essentially one purpose of brand is that by stamping your name on it, I made this thing, I'm proud of this thing I made, I'm willing to put my name on it. It functions as a signal of quality. Even just the fact that it has a brand on it, so that someone was willing to identify themselves as having made it, is supposedly works as a signal of quality. So we've talked a little bit about consistency. Here's the Pepsi Cola evolution of their logo or their brand identity throughout the years. You see it's gone some pretty dramatic changes. Typically this sort of thing is in response to desperation. So Pepsi is sort of behind Coca-Cola. They're in third place now, behind, they may be even further now, but they're, for a while it was Pepsi and Coke, Coke and Pepsi in the 1 and 2 spots after New Coke kind of brought Coke to the top. But then Diet Coke actually replaced Pepsi. So Pepsi has sort of been, very gradually, but losing market share to Coke products. And when you have this situation, what you tend to see is marketers kind of like, oh, let's try a new, some brand manager will be brought in. We're still losing market share. We'll fire them. We'll bring somebody else in. They're like, okay, let's do a logo redesign, or let's do a new logo. That sort of still loses a little bit of market share. They fire that person. They bring the next person in. They try something else. That's kind of what happens. So when you see like Burger King, I think we used in an earlier lecture, we looked at a Burger King example of this where they were changing their tagline over and over again. Pepsi has done this with their brand. And typically, anytime you have that kind of change, it's not ideal. Ideally, what you want is consistency in your brand identity. Here's a good one that has a consistent brand identity and is often cited as as evidence that you can brand anything. So, I mean, what has it been, about 10 years that we started having like fancy sea salts and this kind of thing? But before that, we just kind of had salt. Like it was just like table salt and maybe like bigger versions of table salt. And it's essentially like a chemical compound that was indistinguishable. So you would think that would be a product that would be very commoditized and hard to distinguish between. But as it turns out, Morden was able to create this cool tagline. When it rains, it pours. That has to do with their spout, and this like nice little picture of a girl with an umbrella, and sell their product, which should be a commodity, at a price premium. So this idea of Morton Salt is often cited as there's nothing you can't brand and sell at a premium. All right. Here's another fun one for a minute there. Kellogg, in response to some competition from competing generic cereals developed a technology where they could laser etch the Kellogg logo on every single cornflake that came through the cornflake manufacturing. They ultimately didn't put it into practice, but again, it was the idea that, somehow etching Kellogg into the cornflake will make the cornflake more desirable to people or indicate that it's higher quality than the generic alternatives. Right. So here's another, some food for thought. So we have people who tattoo brands on their body, right? And so brands are not just signals of quality. They really have this other function, and this higher order job to be done is self-signaling to people. So I buy Yeti, I'm an outdoorsy, adventurous person, and that is evidenced by the fact that I buy Yeti. And I affiliate with the brand identity that Yeti has created that I'm even going to tattoo it on the brand of Yeti on my body as kind of a way of telling myself and other people this is the type of person I have. So particularly with these lifestyle brands, Apple, Yeti, you can probably Google brand tattoos and see a bunch of them. But people will put, more generally, not just tattoos, but anytime we wear something with a visible brand on it or put a sticker on our laptop or on our truck or whatever, we're using that brand as a way to sort of craft our self-identity. It would tell other people what we're about and also remind ourselves what we're about. All right, when it comes to products like Yeti coolers, for example, we have this idea that there are different groups of people that adopt them. So we have the first people that had bought the Yeti cooler back in 2007 would be innovators. It was a product that no one had really ever heard of before. Why do I need a cooler that's bear-proof? But they were the innovators. Then we had some early adopters, early majority, and then now it's mainstream, or probably late majority and into our laggards. So the idea here is you have different types of consumers, some that are always trying to buy the latest thing, some that are and really being on the lookout for new products, others that are sort of early adopters, and others that are kind of late to the game. There's also another curve in this space. There is the product life cycle template. So a product is introduced. We have the innovators and the early adopters getting on, and then we have some growth, and then we have our early majority and late majority kind of jumping on there, and that's where we have this mature product, and then we have the laggards. The innovators stop buying it anymore, and we sort of go into decline. Usually in this decline space, companies start saying, we better do something like do a product extension, or we got to keep that growth going. They're under pressure, so they come up with some tactic for trying to get that curve going back up again. We talk a lot about data analytics around the College of Business, and so this is just an example to show you the Bass diffusion model uses both of these curves and estimates from them to sort of estimate how the rate at which a product will diffuse through a marketplace. From a more strategic side, there's some ideas from the book. At the introduction stage, we might think about skimming versus penetration. So skimming, they talk about as being a high price. I would categorize it as charging the highest price you can to a particular group of people for a particular product or value proposition. So skimming, we'll talk about at some point in the language of pricing and revenue management, but essentially it tries to sell products at the highest price possible. Penetration pricing is when you sell something at a loss or in order to build market share. At the growth stage, again, you just want to get the product out there and it's available to many people as possible so that they can purchase it. Maturity stage, the growth is starting to slow down. Maybe you start to, find new segments of people to sell to, new value propositions. In the decline stage, maybe just get rid of it's a to think back to our BCG matrix, it's a kind of a dog at that stage. It's in low growth. You may want to just get rid of it or just minimize the kind of the expenses. Always want to think about some metrics. So one, brand engagement is one to think about. This relates to some sort of emotional attachment to the brand. Lift in the book is defined as sort of the generalized brand perceptions or attitude, I would probably say. And then brand preference is the degree to which a brand is preferred over others in the category. And marketers keep track of a lot of things on maybe a marketing dashboard that are important for the performance of the product. So lastly, in the chapter, they talked about packaging. And obviously, packaging is an exceptionally important part of a product. We have a packaging design institute here at Clemson that focuses on teaching kids how to design cool packaging. We have one of my son's friends collects Apple packaging stuff. We have unboxing videos. When you have this, I showed you that video in the flip where we had this fancy, exotic, ramen packaging that has to be at least 90% of the cost of the production of that product has to be in the packaging, I would guess. It's just, it's part of the, we think about the product features, but really the packaging is sort of very important part of that. All right, so that kind of wraps up our discussion of products. Next set of lectures will be on designing new products and then talking about services.